A heavy mist clung to the trees like wool soaked in milk, and the crows hadn't cried all day. The people in Barrow County knew what that meant. Something unnatural was stirring. But inside the Harrow farmhouse, nestled deep in the gnarled woods at the edge of the ridgeline, Elspeth Harrow had more immediate concerns. The birthing pains had started before sunset, and now, with night falling and no husband in sight, her screams echoed against the warped walls of the house like an animal caught in a trap. Mrs. Della Quinn, the village midwife and something of a healer, was hunched over between Elspeth's knees, sweat glistening on her forehead, her hands blood-stained and trembling. She'd delivered children in every season and condition, through curses and cholera, but never like this. Something was wrong, not with the labor, which progressed oddly smooth, but with the air itself. It was still oppressive. The fire in the hearth burned blue. Then came the first boy, pale as bone, eyes black as storm clouds, not a hint of cry in him. He simply opened his eyes, and wide and calm, and stared directly at Della, as though he recognized her. Before she could speak, Elspeth shrieked again, her back arching off the sweat-soaked sheets. Within minutes, the second child followed, identical in every detail. Same thick black hair, same silent stare, same absence of breath or scream. Della slapped both infants sharply. Nothing. Their chests rose and fell. Yes, but they made no sound. Their tiny heads turned, slowly, toward one another, and then something happened that Della could never quite describe, even in the years that followed. The twins locked eyes and the room fell colder. The wind outside stopped moving. The fire sputtered once and flared tall, casting shadows against the walls that moved a second slower than they should have, and then she saw it, on the napes of their necks. As she wrapped them in linen, the same mark, etched in a dull reddish hue like dried blood, a twisted figure 8 almost burned into the skin. Not a rash, not a birthmark, something deeper, older. Elspeth reached out with shaking hands, tears rolling down her cheeks. "My boys," she whispered, but there was no joy in her voice, only a low, confused awe. One of the twins turned his head to her, and for the briefest moment, she pulled her hand back, unsure of what she saw in that newborn face. Della stood slowly, wiping her hands on her apron, but her gaze never left the boys. She whispered to herself in a voice she barely recognized, "I've delivered children into this world, but these two, these weren't born. They had arrived." 7 years passed and the Harrow twins grew, but not as other children did. Amos and Asa rarely spoke. In fact, no one in Barrow County could recall hearing a single word pass their lips. And yet, they moved through the world with the eerie synchronicity of seasoned dancers, always side by side, always mirroring each other's movements, down to the blink, the breath, the tilt of the head. They walked to the one-room schoolhouse each morning with bare feet and blank expressions, their presence causing the other children to quiet like animals before a storm. At recess, while the others played marbles or kicked stones along the dirt path, the twins would sit silently beneath the same crooked tree, eyes fixed on the dense woods beyond the fence line. Sometimes they'd tilt their heads at the exact same angle, listening to something no one else could hear. The other children whispered that if you stared too long at them, your nose would start to bleed. Miss Renly, the school teacher, tried to treat them like the rest in offering books, arithmetic drills, questions about crops and seasons, but the boys only stared at her, as if every word she spoke was already known to them. It unsettled her. On a dare from the town reverend, she once decided to test the boys' strange bond. She separated them, sent Amos to sit in the back closet with a slate and chalk, and left Asa in his seat at the front of the room. She told the other children to remain quiet, and for a few moments the room was still. Asa sat, eyes closed, as if in deep concentration. Then it happened. Amos let out a dry gasp from the closet. A thin line of blood slipped from his nose. At that exact moment, Asa stiffened in his chair, his back arching unnaturally before he collapsed to the floor, convulsing. The children screamed. One girl wet herself. Miss Renly rushed to them, heart thundering in her chest, and found Amos slumped against the wall, unconscious but breathing. Asa, eyes wide open on the floor, whispered something she could never recall, though she would hear it in her dreams for years. From that day on, no one tried to separate them again. Even their mother, Elspeth, seemed diminished. She had taken to speaking softly to empty rooms and refused to let the boys sleep apart. She claimed they never closed their eyes, that she would wake at night to find them sitting up in bed, facing each other in perfect stillness, their eyes gleaming with something more than reflection. Local dogs barked at the house without reason. Mirrors cracked in the Harrow home without anyone touching them. One morning, every clock in town stopped at the same time. 3:33 a.m. No one thought much of it until old Mr. Lindley claimed he'd seen the twins out walking in the fields at that exact hour, barefoot in the frost, carving something into the dirt with long, thin sticks. A spiral, he said, two of them turning inward. By now, the people of Barrow County didn't speak the twins' names unless they had to. Children were told not to look them in the eye, and still the boys wandered among them, silent as shadows, bound by a tether no one could see or cut. It was the height of summer when the air turned thick and unnatural, like the earth was holding its breath. The woods were quieter than usual, and the crickets stopped their song before sundown. That was the week little Sarah Pike vanished. Sarah was 9, the daughter of the local cooper, and as spirited as they came, always with a ribbon in her hair and dirt on her knees. She'd gone out late afternoon to gather blackberries near the edge of the Harrow property. She never came back. By nightfall, half the town was out with lanterns and torches, calling her name into the trees. The woods swallowed the sound. For 3 days they searched. On the 4th, a search party led by Reverend Marin found her at the bottom of the Harrow well, a stone ring set deep in the overgrown field just behind the farmhouse. Her body floated limp and pale in the water, hair fanned out like dark seaweed. Her mouth was open as though caught mid-scream, her lips blue with cold though the summer air was hot as breath. Her hands were a ruin of broken fingers and torn nails, as if she had clawed the well walls all the way down. Elspeth Harrow stood on the porch unmoving, as they pulled the child from the water. Her eyes were sunken, her cheeks hollow, but she said nothing. The twins sat just inside the doorway, peering out from the shadows, Amos with his hand resting lightly on Asa's, their expressions as unreadable as ever. When Reverend Marin met their eyes, he stepped back. Later he would confess to hearing a high, ringing tone in his ears and feeling the unmistakable sensation of falling, though he hadn't moved. Sheriff Harlan, a thick, red-faced man with a short temper and a long rifle, did what most expected him to do. He stormed into the Harrow house that evening, pistol drawn, demanding answers. The townspeople gathered outside, hushed and uneasy, clutching crosses and kerchiefs. No one dared enter with him. Inside it was dark and bitter cold, though the stove still glowed red. The twins sat at the kitchen table facing one another, unmoving. Sheriff Harlan shouted, "Accusations!" Threats, prayers, but the boys said nothing. Then as he stepped closer, both boys turned their heads to him in perfect unison. They began to scream, not like children, not like humans. A layered sound, high and low, deep and sharp. A shriek that rattled the glass in the windows and made every candle in the room extinguish at once. Outside, every mirror in the Harrow house shattered with a sound like ice cracking underfoot. Sheriff Harlan staggered out moments later, blood running from both nostrils, eyes unfocused. He muttered something. They see through each other. Before collapsing onto the grass, he died that night in the apothecary's back room, his veins gone black as tar. The coroner refused to perform a post-mortem, burned the body instead. After that, no one questioned the Harrow boys again. But the fear set in deeper like rot beneath the floorboards. Women carved charms into their doorframes. Men buried iron nails at the corners of their land. Children were told never to go near the Harrow place, even in daylight, even in dreams. But late at night, some still claimed to hear soft footsteps, pacing the fields around the well, always in pairs, always in time. Word of the Harrow twins had spread beyond Barrow County like a rot through roots. Stories whispered in taverns and written in trembling ink made their way to academic circles in Lexington, and from there to the ear of Dr. Julius Rames, and a physician, natural philosopher and self-proclaimed man of logic. He had traveled through Europe studying mesmerism, phrenology, and the fledgling field of comparative neurology. He had seen oddities, he claimed, twins who shared fevers, brothers who dreamed the same dreams. But what he heard of Amos and Asa intrigued him beyond mere curiosity. It challenged him. In the summer of 1834, he rode into Barrow County, in a black coach with polished brass handles and a pair of thick journals, wrapped in oilskin. He arrived wearing spectacles darkened against the sun and a solemn expression. The townspeople watched him with a kind of pity. They'd seen men come to fix the twins before. None returned unchanged. Dr. Rames took up lodging in the empty rectory, now abandoned after Reverend Marin left town shaking and half-mad. From there, he paid a visit to the Harrow home, bringing gifts, books of anatomy, imported chocolates, a strange brass pendulum. Elspeth, gaunt and listless, let him in with a single nod. She said only once quietly, "You can study them if you like, but they are not yours to understand." The twins watched him with that same unreadable gaze, always together, never apart. Dr. Rames took meticulous notes, heart rates in perfect rhythm, identical brain patterns according to his galvanic instruments, simultaneous muscle spasms when only one was prodded. He recorded everything, their refusal to sleep at the same time, the way they mimicked each other before one had moved, as though the intent came not after but before action itself. But his fascination darkened. He began to fixate. Night after night, he'd be seen pacing the graveyard outside the rectory, muttering about mirror neurons, pre-birth cognition, and soul bifurcation. He theorized the boys shared not just sensations, but consciousness, and one mind split between two forms, seeing the world from two angles at once. Then, on a night when the moon was red and full, a detail scribbled hastily in his last recorded entry, Dr. Rames attempted what he called the definitive test. He locked Amos in the barn with metal restraints softened by cloth, and led Asa down into the root cellar of the Harrow home. He told Elspeth he'd return by dawn. The storm began just after midnight. Wind screamed through the trees like a chorus of wolves. The barn was found open in the morning, doors blown inward, hinges bent. Inside, the restraints lay empty, twisted like ribbon. In the cellar, the smell of sulfur was thick and raw. Elspeth sat at the top of the steps, whispering a lullaby with no words. Dr. Rames was never seen again, but his journal was found, pages torn and waterlogged, left on the steps of the old chapel. One final entry remained, scrawled in shaking ink. They do not dream. They remember. They do not share a soul. They are its two halves, not brothers, not separate. One being split by something older than time. They are not human as we know it. They are a window. And I think something is starting to look back. After that, the townspeople stopped pretending. No one entered the Harrow property again. Even the birds flew wide around it. Winter came early that year. The frost moved in before the leaves had finished falling, and the wind carried with it a bitter scent, not of snow or wood smoke, but of iron and ash. The Harrow house stood quiet, still as bone beneath a sky that never quite brightened even at noon. No smoke rose from the chimney. No footprints broke the thin crust of snow, just silence, thick and watching. It was Mrs. Delaquin, the old midwife, now stooped and half-blind, who first noticed. She claimed she hadn't seen the boys walking the edge of the property in weeks. Elspeth hadn't come into town for salt or flour. Curious but afraid, a few townsmen rode out one morning, armed with crucifixes, hunting knives, and 3 dogs that refused to pass the edge of the fence. They found the house cold, the door open, the hearth extinguished. No signs of struggle, no sign of the Harrows at all. Elspeth's shawl still hung from the hook by the door. A bowl of water sat frozen solid on the table. Upstairs, 2 small beds stood perfectly made, as though no one had ever slept in them. But most disturbing was what they found in the center of the floor, where the dining table had been moved aside. A blackened spiral, seared into the wood as though by fire, though nothing else had burned. Around it, the faint outline of 2 pairs of bare feet, facing each other, toes barely touching. The spiral was cold to the touch, but left a tingling in the fingers for hours. They searched the woods, the root cellar, the barn. Nothing, no blood, no bodies, no trace. Just a sense, unspoken but deeply felt, that they were gone, but not in the way people go missing. By spring, Barrow County had begun to change. The crops wouldn't grow, livestock were born dead or not at all. The birds flew over without stopping. One by one, families packed up and left, their wagons heavy with silence and fear. Those who stayed began to carve protective runes into their doors. Mirrors were covered. Children were told not to speak the names Amos and Asa, not even in whispers, not even in dreams. Della Quinn was the last to go mad. They found her wandering the churchyard in her nightdress, singing a tune no one recognized. Her eyes rolled white as milk. She claimed she had seen them, not in the flesh, but in the mirror. Juan walked in, she muttered over and over, her hands twitching with invisible threads. One walked in, one walked out, but no one knows which was which. They say she scratched a spiral into the stone floor of her cell, with her fingernails before her heart stopped. Now Barrow County exists only in faded land records and forgotten maps. The land where the Harrow home once stood is thick with thorns and briars that never die. No matter how hard the wind tears at them, nothing grows there. No bird's nest, no animals pass through. But every year on the longest night, crows gather above the field, circling in a perfect spiral before scattering just before dawn. And sometimes, just sometimes, if you stand very still near the old well and listen closely, you'll hear two sets of footsteps in the snow, walking, always together, always in time,